and welcome to the Gaslight. Tonight we're going to take you back in time to a time that is so fondly remembered by so many of the people here. And we have some of those icons here with us tonight. Our first guest that I want to introduce you to is going to introduce this performance. And it's so fitting that she does this because she was there. She was a fixture in the Gaslight. She was Bob Dylan's first manager, and she was married to Dave Van Ronk. So the person that knows what this was really like is Terri Thal. So welcome, Terri, tonight. She's going to take you back in time.
Which mic?
This one right here in front of you, sweetheart.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I am not used to all these lights. My background is as a manager and as a public relations person, and I'm used to being the person in the back who publicizes the person who's on stage and helps promote the person who's on stage and who says, don't pop your peas. Be careful, look at the audience, remember that there are Klieg lights out there. I am not used to being on stage and being in the Klieg lights, so all of this is pretty damn new to me. So, hi. And it's kind of interesting to have it happen when you're in your 80s. Gotta tell you, it's weird. So. And the Gaslight was a long time ago. The Gaslight was like over 60 years ago. When I hit the Village really in the mid-late 50s, there were folk singers like Theo Bickel and Cynthia Gooding, people who you probably never heard of, and they played in theaters and clubs very late at night. On weekends, after a theater would close, after the show would close, a folk singer would come in and be able to perform and get paid. And they were theaters where, I know one of them was the Theatre Solis, where I heard Three Penny Opera, which some of you may know, on Christopher Street. Absolutely incredible, fantastic. I was in my teens, but it was an incredible play, and it's kind of interesting because I will mention something else about it later on. But there was no place for young musicians to perform. These were older people, and by older I mean maybe in their 30s or 40s. The age difference then was astronomical. If you were 18 and somebody else was 25, that person was a grown-up. It really was different. The difference between the younger folk singers and who had barely ever been on stage, and the older ones, some of the ones who had recorded, it was like they were worshipped. The ones who had recorded were worshipped. They were gods. They were successful. They weren't necessarily successful. They weren't necessarily making any money, but to the younger people, they were like, they had really made it. It was a very, very different world. You could hear younger people playing folk music on weekends. In Washington Square, when the weather was really good, people played in the circle. At the American Youth Hostel on 8th Street, which closed probably when I was 25. You could hear it at a coffee house called The Caricature on McDougal Street, which nobody has ever heard of. It was upstairs. It was over what became the Gaslight. It was a little place, and Liz, the owner, let the young folk singers sit around and play for each other, not for an audience. Nobody got paid, but it was a place where we could hang out, and I was not a musician. When I say we, I mean the folk singers, and I was part of that crowd because I was part of that crowd. And they didn't get paid. The younger folk singers were so eager to perform that a group of them and some other people, which included me, organized a small organization called the Folk Singers Guild, and we sponsored concerts. We sponsored them in high schools and junior highs, and all the proceeds got divided up among the performers. And we were not professional concert players, and they weren't professional performers. And the least amount of money they ever got, I remember one concert at which there were so few people in the audience that each performer got $1. And there were only 3 performers. And I remember who 2 of them were. So they weren't exactly stomping grounds or ways to get heard. But then in 1960, something interesting happened. A very interesting, strange, slightly insane man named John Mitchell opened a coffee house in a basement room on McDougal Street, and he called it the Gaslight. And he started to bring poets in to read. The entertainment was poets. This was supposed to be, quote, the beat generation, and the poets were all supposed to be beatniks. Well, I knew all of those poets, and I got to tell you, I ain't never met a beatnik in my life. I would not know what a beatnik was if it hit me on the head, and it probably did. The Gaslight started as what we called a basket house. A poet would read, and either the poet or a waitress, and it was always a waitress, and she was always pretty. It was never a waiter. So either the poet or this pretty waitress would pass a basket, and the audience would be asked to put money in the basket, and that's how the poet would get paid. So Leroy Jones would pass a basket, and he would get paid. And then Ted Jones would come on, another poet. They both happened to have the same last names. And the audience would be very reluctant to put their hands in their pocket and shell out money for Ted Jones, because they just did it for Leroy Jones. And they certainly weren't going to do it after that for John Brent or for Hugh Romney, who later became known as Wavy Gravy, and some of you may have read about him. So the owner of John Mitchell had to do something. He had to either change the way he charged, or he had to turn over the audience. He had to have the audience get up and leave after Ted Jones, have a new audience come in, have them shell out for Leroy Jones, and so on and so forth. So he got a brilliant idea. He would book folk singers, and a folk singer would come in and play after the poet read, and the folk singer would drive out the audience, because the audience would hate the folk singer. You know the rest of the story. Within 6 months, poets were gone, folk singers were in, and hip, hip, hooray, the young folk singers had a place to play. Other coffee houses started to open, and the others were also basket houses, but there were some that weren't. And by 1961, maybe 1962, you could walk down the streets of the village. You could walk down, I don't know how many of you are New Yorkers, I presume most of you are, but you could walk down 3rd Street, you could walk down McDougal Street, you could walk down Bleecker Street. There was sort of this route you could take, and it wasn't really much more than 5 blocks. And you really could hear folk music coming out of stores and clubs up and down the street. Most of them were what we called basket houses, but the Gaslight started to pay performers. The Bitter End, which opened around the corner on Bleecker Street, a couple blocks away, paid performers. And Gertie's Folk City, which was a liquor club, and opened about 6 blocks away from that strip, paid performers. They started to pay performers a salary. And there was a difference in the clubs. The Gaslight was my home. When I wasn't in the Gaslight, I was next door in the bar, the Kettle of Fish. And when I wasn't there, I was over at Gertie's Folk City. These were the places that people who listened to Dave Van Ronk, Tom Paxton, Mississippi John Hurt, Pat Sky, Skip James, Phil Oakes, Mance Lifkin, people. I met the cast of this show last night, and they asked me, "Who did you hear?" And I blanked. I literally went blank. I mean, I could list 50 in the back of the book that I am going to show you, that I'll be selling later. I list people who were either performers or around the folk music world, people like me, people like producers, some club owners in the 1960s. And I sat down one day when I was writing that book, and I did that list just sort of idly. It was sort of casual. It came out of the inside of my head. And when I finished my initial list, there were 90 names there. They'd all come out of my head. And when you ask me who did I hear there, I go blank. It's like, I heard so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. It was great music. It was wonderful. My gods were the blues singers. My gods were Gary Davis, John Hurt, Skip James, but there were all these other people. Around the corner, the bitter end featured more commercial acts. What was a more commercial act? Somebody who could command more money. And they were people like Odetta, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Josh White Jr., the Chambers Brothers, Judy Collins, and countless more. Gertie's Folk City, which was a liquor club, and musicians had to join the union to play there, was the place that attracted everybody from out of New York. Everybody from out of New York wanted to play the Gaslight. All of the more folky folk singers also, they wanted to play Gertie's Folk City. All the more folky folk singers wanted to play the Gaslight. What was it about the Gaslight? It was the people who ran it. John was a very strange man. You will learn more about John this evening. When he sold the club, he sold it to some very interesting Southern people named Clarence, a guy named Clarence Hood. And one interesting story that I shouldn't tell because it'll take too much time is, I don't know how many of you know who Mississippi John Hurt is. Okay, Mississippi John Hurt, who was black, and Clarence Hood, who was white, and was a stalwart in the Democratic Party in Mississippi, sat down over bourbon one day and had a conversation, and they learned that they had been at the same lynching. It was really interesting. I was not at the table at that time. I learned about it another time. I can't imagine what John thought. I really can't. And then around also on Bleecker Street, there was a club called the Café Au Go-Go. And the Café Au Go-Go opened a bit later, and it was maybe the most exciting club in New York. I think the Gaslight was the best. The Au Go-Go booked people like the Paul Butterfield band. It booked my friends, the Blues Project. It booked Howling Wolf. I heard Muddy Waters there for the first time, which was a trip, I gotta tell you. I heard Cream there. I heard Lenny Bruce there. Uh, and this was the music. This was the music that we were steeped in. And the Gaslight was kind of the nexus of all of it. And throughout that whole time, the musicians were a community. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Inside Llewyn Davis. I hated it. Because it really denigrated the musicians. The musicians shared music, they shared stories, they shared friendship, they shared bookings. There was competition, but there was never spite, there was never meanness, there was never anything, none of those kind of cutthroat attitudes. My own professional story was that I was married to Dave Van Ronk. And at some point, must have been around 1960, maybe early 1961, David, who had a manager, which was a very grown-up thing, very professional at that time. We were very proud that he had a manager. His manager booked him into a club in Pennsylvania that obviously wasn't going to pay him. They weren't making any money, and they weren't going to pay him. Dave got angry with the manager, and he fired him. And he turned to me and he said, "Be my manager." And it sounded like a lot more fun than doing graduate work in political science, which I hated, because there was no American Studies program at the city colleges. So I said, okay, and I had just finished my coursework, and I was about to embark on a boring thesis. So I said, okay, and I became his manager. And sometime later, Dave came home either from playing at the Gaslight or from just hanging out, and he said, "I heard this really weird kid at one of the basket houses tonight. You got to hear him. He's a genius." So the next night, I trotted down to one of the basket houses, and I heard this young guy, and you have read books that say this young guy who stumbled onto stage and looked kind of klutzy and couldn't play his guitar very well and couldn't sing very well and had this cap that he kept kind of blowing off his head at people and grinning in a really kind of inane-looking way. And he had a just really loopy-looking stage presence, and he sounded like Jack Elliott imitating Woody Guthrie. And yes, he was a genius of sorts. And how do you know somebody is a genius of sorts? I haven't a clue. I really don't. I just know that within 2 months, I was managing Bob. We became very good friends, and one day he said to me, "Will you get me gigs?" And I said, "I'll try." And I cut a tape of him, and I took it to clubs all over the East Coast, and everybody listened to the tape and said, "What are you, crazy? You want me to book that? Blah, go away." So I went away, I got him some jobs, and I forced the Cafe Lena in Saratoga Springs to hire him. And within a year, all of those clubs were begging him to work for them. And now, of course, everybody says, "Oh, I was one of the first clubs to hire Bob Dylan, blah, blah." Which is the way, which is the way things go. And 6 months later, Bob signed with a very commercial manager with a lot of clout, and his career started to take off, and he told me about it after he signed with the guy, which I thought was clinically interesting. I was not angry, I was hurt. Never occurred to me anybody would do anything like that. But we remained friends, and Susie and I, his then girlfriend, remained friends until she died of cancer sometime after 9/11, and she never smoked a cigarette in her life. A lot of this stuff is, and this was what the folk music world was like. It was interesting, it was fun, there was some wonderful, wonderful music. And while the New York scene wound down by the end of the 60s, I stopped managing because it had turned into a world that I didn't want to be in. it never ended. It kind of phased out in the village, but it changed, and a scene opened in Woodstock, and festivals continued all over the country, and you can still hear great folk music, and I think you're going to hear some of it tonight. So, I do want to tell you that after the show, my book, I will be signing and selling copies of my book out there in the back. Richard Barone, who is a wonderful writer and a wonderful musician, will be signing, well, he doesn't have physical copies with him, but he will be selling copies of his very good book, Music and Revolution, which is about that world. And he has physical copies. He will be signing and selling a vinyl record called Richard Barone's Sorrows and Promises, Greenwich Village in the 1960s, which is recordings by some of the people who played those clubs and coffee houses. And you will like the books, you will like the show, and I'm delighted to turn you over to my world. Thanks.